Very pleased to have once again an economist and my friend, TCA Srinivasa Raghavan. He's based in Delhi and he's an economic journalist apart from being an economist. So he keeps his ears open and eyes open and knows what's going on. Let's listen to him. Over to you.
Well, we are now about 2 weeks away from the next general election. And the expectation is that this government will be returned to power, but we don't know by what margin. Elections are funny things, so they may not be returned to power. But the probability is high that this Narendra Modi will once again form the next government. Now, last 10 years, the economy has been sort of, spluttering along. There are claims that it's doing extremely well, but I don't know whether you can call an average growth rate over 10 years of about 4%, 4.5% great. But it is what it is. Maybe 5%. Inflation has been pretty bad. In the last 10 years, I think prices have gone up by, average prices of various things have gone up by 45, 50%. That's also par for the course. We shouldn't be too surprised. The exchange rate has depreciated by around 15%, 18%. So that's also par for the course. What is not par for the course, what is not good, is incomes of even those who are employed have been stagnating. Just to give you one brief kind of window into what's happening in the job market, at the higher end of skills, the IT fellows, the software engineers, and so on, in 2013, the entry-level pay was 3 lakhs, and it continues to be that per year. You're taking them at about 30,000 rupees, 27, 28, 30, 35,000 rupees a month, and that hasn't changed. So if that's the situation there, even given all the sort of, problems with the global market, etc., exports stagnating in America, sort of, Trump administration coming down on software exports from India, all that, Russia, Ukraine, all that you take. The fact remains that incomes are not rising even at the upper end. This contrasts hugely with the fact that the demand for luxury items like high-end cars and other stuff, even in India, you'd call it air conditioner, a 1.5-ton air conditioner or a 2-ton air conditioner, a luxury item for most people. The demand for even those things has been increasing. So it's a peculiar situation where for the bulk of the population, incomes are not rising, but the demand for luxury stuff is increasing. Consumer spending, the picture is not at all clear because the last consumer expenditure survey that they did, from all accounts, it was a poor survey and the findings were never released. Recently, something came out which shows that consumption expenditure has been going up. We don't know how accurate that is. But in general, yes, I suspect that if there is this degree of inflation, then there must be some demand and therefore there must be some expenditure and so on. So we needn't get too worried about it. Short point I'm making is that if you analyze what is happening in the Indian economy as an economist would, or a normal sort of, economist view of it, then all these parameters look okay. It's like a doctor taking your blood pressure and, blood test, this, all of that, heartbeat. all of that, and then you'd come to the conclusion that, yeah, things look pretty okay. That said, the question remains, as it has indeed since 1947, what is the rate of growth of the economy that India should be having, given its basically the number of people who are looking for jobs, or at least incomes, work, even if not jobs.
Yeah.
And that number has, it's been going up from 1.2% to 2.5, 3.5, 4.5, like that. It's been going up. It even reached around 8.5% at one point. All that is fine, but it's not enough. So I've been doing this journalism stuff with some economics thrown in for the last 40 years, 44 now. And when you actually start looking at it very seriously, it's not the normal economic things that are holding back the rate of growth, like investment or raw materials or imports. Those things are okay, but those are not the things that are the real problem. To my mind, now after 70 years, the real problem is what I call the soft infrastructure. You can build your bridges and your roads and your ports and airports and all the rest of it. But the soft infrastructure in the country, which really speaking, you could take it as the parliament, executive, judiciary, civil services, the guys who service the constitution, as it were. These things, they are simply not up to what is required if the country wants to step up its rate of growth from an average of about 6% to an average of about 8 or 9% in a 10-year period.
Okay, can I just stop you there for a second to clarify to add? In the theoretical literature, we sometimes call these as institutions with a capital I.
That's right.
Not with a small I, a capital I, to emphasize that these are the bedrock on which the economy operates.
Correct.
And if you don't have these institutions in place, then your economy will always be in some kind of a struggle. So I just want to add that from the theoretical perspective. Okay. All right, fine. So what you're calling a soft infrastructure is
institutions, basically.
With capital I. With capital I. All right, let's go.
The thing is that our institutions are very good, but they're not good enough. That's the problem.
Yeah.
Now, you take your dad, my dad, they were all civil servants. They were in the IAS, which means they did a certain type of job. The IAS, for example, today is in charge of formulating policy and putting it up to the political bosses. And then they say, don't do this, do that, etc. So essentially, the question we have to ask is, are the guys who are writing policy, do they know what they're doing? And I can unequivocally say that by and large, 90% of the time, they don't know what they're doing. For the simple reason that had they been getting things more right than they have been getting, then the success rate of different policies would not have been so poor, 20, 25%. So obviously, there is something wrong in the way the policy design is done. Implementation is a completely different thing, but the policy design is itself faulty, primarily because the guys who are doing it don't know what they're doing. And it's not as if this is a recent deterioration. This has been there throughout. when the economy was small, the effects were small.
Yeah.
But now the economy is large, the effects are very, very large.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one institutional problem that you have, that the bureaucracy, which is in charge of designing policies, doesn't know what it's doing by and large.
Okay.
This you have to contrast with the other institutions of economic governance, like the Reserve Bank of India, the Securities and Exchange Board of India, or the Telecom Regulatory Authority, or the Insurance Regulatory Authority, or any other sort of, or even things like the railways.
Yeah.
The trains may not run on time, but they run.
Yeah.
And considering the number of fellows they carry and the number of trains we run per day, they do a pretty good job. The Reserve Bank is doing an excellent job, whichever way you sort of look at it. They may make a mess once in a while, but by and large, 95% of the time they get it right. SEBI.
By the way, let me just stop you there. When you talk about the RBI, are you talking about the foreign exchange part, or are you talking about also their job as the regulator of banks?
Yeah, I was just going to come to that. I am talking of overall.
Okay.
But since you asked the question about the regulation of banks, the Reserve Bank has a peculiar problem there, that it is owned by the government 100%, and the banks, which account for about 75% of assets, the loan portfolio, they are also owned by the government.
Yeah.
The government also happens to be the biggest borrower, and the debt management is being done by the Reserve Bank. So, judging the Reserve Bank on banking supervision is extremely difficult because it doesn't have the final say.
Okay.
It's constantly constrained by government interference. There's no other word for it. It's come down in the last 10 years. For sure, it has come down because that's how they managed to come out of this huge NPA crisis that we had in 2014. So now the banks are in a good situation because the finance ministry said, we will not interfere, you do what you have to do. So things are looking okay.
Okay.
Exchange rate policy, monetary policy, they're all interlinked with all these things, the way the government borrows, etc. You know how it works. So, but the RBI is doing a good job. SEBI is, well, I would say they're 70%, 75% of the time they get it right. But when they make a mistake, then they make huge mistakes. And that's because there is a problem of regulatory capture there. It's a very insidious thing. You can't actually put your finger on it, but there is an element of that as far as the markets, stock market is concerned.
Well, just to clarify what regulatory capture means, it means that those whom you are seeking to regulate are actually controlling you. So you cannot regulate them. I'm just explaining the term.
This is exactly the problem with the banks.
Yeah.
So that's there. Then the Telecom Regulatory Authority does a very good job for the simple reason that the government's telecom companies have gone bust. BSNL, MTNL, the rest of them. So now it's all in the private sector. And in general, the services are efficient and cheap. And you can't really ask for very much more than that. Profit levels are high, but that's because the market is, so huge. And usage is so huge. So that's okay. Insurance is a bit of a problem.
Before we go ahead there, let me distinguish between cellular service and Wi-Fi. Okay. Cellular is cheap and good, but Wi-Fi is, let me say, spotty, because I have done so many interviews with Vidpeds like this.
Yeah.
And there's rain in Mumbai, you cannot get on video. You cannot get the Wi-Fi. There are people saying, sir, it's not in my village, it's not in my hometown. So cellular is everywhere. but that's a text and voice. But when you are talking Wi-Fi, that is certainly not up to the mark. If
It's
you look
very
at,
spotty.
right, you look at the Wi-Fi speed as measured in global terms,
Yeah,
it is far too low
correct.
to be called good. And the
Yeah,
spotty, I'm doing interviews with village kids, and you just cannot understand what they're saying because it's coming on Wi-Fi.
yeah.
You can't understand.
That's right. Yeah, right. So, but
Cellular is good.
that's I mean, there are issues of cost fundamentally and wiring and so on. So uh, it is a problem, and hopefully TRAI will address it far more aggressively than it's been doing. The short point I'm making is compared to uh, the guys who formulate policy, who design policy, compared in the ministries, whichever ministry it might be, uh, compared to them, these specialized institutions,
Yeah.
they do a far better job
Okay.
of
I get
whatever
it.
they're supposed to do.
Yeah, I get it.
But they're all employed by the government.
Yeah.
So there's a problem there. Now, the provision of services to the government for governance, as if you regard that as a major institutional problem in
Yes.
India,
Yes.
it is both good and bad. So the government now, the next government has to focus on which part of it is the weakest link in the chain, and you have to fix it. And it is my belief that it is the generalist services. So I've been writing for the last 20 years that what we need is the equivalent of what Jawaharlal Nehru had thought of way back in 1951 or 52, the industrial management pool, which was set up in 1953, but then the ICS fellows killed it. Then he also set up in 1961 the Indian Economic Service, and then the IAS fellows killed it, and so on. So there's a problem there, which the next prime minister, whoever it is, has to solve if you want to get up to a much higher rate of growth on a consistent basis, because the economic agents need to be serviced properly.
Okay.
So that's one problem.
Okay.
The other problem is the constitution itself. In India, we get very hot and exercised when there is any talk of changing the constitution. And the entire focus goes on to, the Hindu, secular, this, that, first-class citizen, second-class citizen, fundamental rights, individual rights. These, out of the 295 or so articles in the Constitution, these constitute but till about 42, 45 articles of the Constitution. So I, along with a cousin of mine, we wrote a book 4 years ago. It sank out of place because of COVID. But in that, I had argued that we need to relook at the Constitution from a very different perspective, not just from the secular and Hindutva and all of that, socialist, all that nonsense. That's okay. The problem with the Constitution is that it is, compared to other constitutions, it's been amended about 108 times. Now, you have to say that if you have to amend your Constitution 108 times,
right,
what is wrong with it?
Right.
That's one. The other is that even the amendments have been focusing on fixing the processes. Our Constitution, right from the beginning, has been focused a lot. In fact, about 85, 90% of it is focused on processes. How will you do this? How will you do that? These are not things which a constitution should be concerning itself with. I'll give you a very, very recent example, an ongoing problem in India right now. Kerala wants to borrow more than it is being allowed to borrow, or under the rules. So it has gone to the Supreme Court saying that under Article 292, 293, it's a right. I should be allowed to borrow as much as I want to. But Article 292 binds Article 293 saying that you can only borrow as much as the central government allows you to borrow.
Okay.
I mean, not quite in those words, but that's the effect. Now, why should a constitution be concerning itself with the borrowing limits of the center and state governments, central and state governments? It's simply not a constitutional issue. But in India it is, so it's gone to the Supreme Court. There's going to be a bench which will decide on this issue. Now, if the Supreme Court is not going to apply economic measures, is going to apply some concept of justice, equity, or whether it is consistent with the wording or the intention of the constitutional framework, blah, 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 all the rest of that. But then we also have what the FRBM, for example, fiscal responsibility, budget management, whatever it is.
Yeah.
The act was passed in 2015. Now, if that comes into conflict with the constitution, then what are you going to do? So there is a problem in the manner in which both the constitution and parliament function in respect of economic issues. It's a major institutional problem. Now the judiciary gets into it. You're completely familiar with the spate of judgments that we had in the 70s when the court was so socialist in its orientation. So they killed the labor market, such as it was after the Industrial Disputes Act was done in 1956, revised in 56. They basically killed the labor market. And there was no flexibility. So investments and all the rest of it got affected. And the scale issues came up. You're familiar with all of that.
Yeah.
Now, this government tried to fix it, but it's not had the political courage to go ahead with it and do it. So, and that's because these things are justiciable under Article 32. Because anybody can go up and say my fundamental rights are being violated, and then it becomes the court's fancy whether it takes it up or not. So I'm not saying Article 32 shouldn't be there, but the point is that the court should be much more judicious in what cases it takes up. So the judiciary as an institution can sometimes get in the way of quick economic growth because it comes in the way of quick investment because of the kind of judicial pronouncements we have had of regulating different markets. Finance, for example, you can have we've had the court announcing that interest rates should not be more than this or something. I mean, this is really not a matter to be, shouldn't go to the judiciary. So you have the civil service, which is not up to the mark for ratcheting up the rate of growth. You have your judicial stuff and the constitutional stuff, which again are not, geared to delivering that higher rate of growth. Mind you, I'm not saying people's rights should be abridged or anything like that. I'm simply saying don't create problems which prevent investment. That's the bottom line. Now, the other big problem, and believe me, it's so endemic, is corruption, institutional corruption. To the best of my knowledge, Subodh, the only institution whose integrity has never come into question so far is the Reserve Bank of India.
Okay.
It's extraordinary that in so many years, they just did their 90th year day before yesterday or something, and they've not had that problem of the kind of corruption we're talking of. That doesn't happen there. But the rest of our institutions, you know how bad they are. And this problem of institutionalized corruption is coming in the way of investment now. Now, in 2018 or 19, whatever it was, the government the Modi government brought down the corporate tax rates to international levels.
Yeah.
And for fresh investment, the corporate tax was lowered to 15%.
Yeah.
The normal rate is around 22%.
Yeah.
And yet investments are not forthcoming. So if
Yeah.
you talk to these people, which in my profession I am able to do on and off, they say it's just too costly to invest in India.
Yeah.
It's not just the cost of acquiring land and so on. It's simply that if you want a power connection, you have to pay. If you want a water connection, you have to pay. If you want some other thing, regulatory stuff, you have to pay. So everybody is gouging the businessman.
Yeah.
This is, and it's accepted as they say in Hindi, ye to banta hai. Now, this problem of institutionalized corruption, if we are not able to solve it, Modi has tried, but pretty half-hearted and pretty one-sided. I mean, he's gone after the opposition parties, and but he hasn't really gone after the bureaucratic corruption, which is also a huge problem. So, short point is that we need a much higher rate of economic growth. And for that, we need a much higher rate of investment and ease of doing business, all of that stuff. And the institutional infrastructure, parliament, judiciary, civil service, these guys are simply not, they're working, the disk operating systems are, they're not up to the mark. I mean, it's like having an old computer to run a faster software, newer software.
Yeah.
So I guess that's how I see the problem.
Okay.
I don't know whether the next government will be able to address this problem because, these are entrenched vested interests. So let's see what happens. Modi made a beginning. By the way, the guy who was in charge of implementing some of this at least was our old classmate, P.K. Mishra, Pramod Mishra, if you remember him. Yeah. So as principal private secretary, there were two Mishras there. He was known as the Chota Mishra, and he was in charge of all this. And now he's the Bada Mishra, the only Mishra. And so that's where it stands. So let's see what happens after the election. I don't know.
Let me come in and say that in my book, I call these as meta-economic factors.
Yes.
So the meta-economic factors are the social and political administrative factors which govern the growth and functioning of the economy. So, broadly speaking, the discussion of constitution is also there. You didn't talk much about the chief ministers, but nowadays everybody talks about them. But you mentioned Kerala. So the whole institutional system, which you and I are calling here with capital I, and the constitutional chaos of concurrent jurisdiction also, which is just chaos because it allows people to keep blaming the prime minister for poor elementary education when the poor prime minister has nothing to do with it. But the prime minister, because it's in the education, is in the concurrent thing, says I'm responsible for health, which is pushed into the concurrent. But in COVID, it became clear that the prime minister has zero staff in health.
Yes.
So why is this concurrent thing there? What is it meaning? Why is the prime minister being blamed for what the chief minister should be doing? So these meta-economic factors are really, and I just want to emphasize that term because I think, I thought about it a long time, and it allows you to summarize many points by saying, look, the growth rate of the economy depends upon how well your meta-economic factors are suitable for your country. If they're not, you're not going to get 10%. Now you can say, well, China, they didn't have all these institutions, but the lack of institutions is itself an institution because you had centralized command, right?
Yeah.
And their meta-economic factors were suitable for the kind of growth that they could. We cannot have that. but we have to fix our meta-economic factors, if I can summarize what you're saying. And this is a huge challenge because very few people focus on it. They are all focused.
Absolutely.
They are
Yeah.
all focused on details. Let us put it this way. There's too much obsession with details and not enough with the long-term structural issues that
Absolutely.
come up. Okay, good. So you and I
Yep.
think, are finding the same kind of things. Now we may or may not agree on every point, but the overall view is that, look, we cannot run the economy on this basis and hope to be a regional power anytime soon. We can claim to be the third largest economy. We're never going to be the second largest by GDP. So what's a bronze medal worth these days? You know, people don't even look at the silver medalist. Bronze
Yes.
they say, what is that?
Yeah.
Okay, anyway, thank you so much.
Yes. Thanks, Subodh. Thanks a lot.
Okay,
Thanks. Thanks. Yeah.
I'm glad to have you back. And as usual, with a very sharp eye on what's happening in India. I don't live there, so I rely on people like you to tell me what's going on. I just want to ask, is there any public policy issue that you think is very important to be resolved, and not just an economic issue, but any public policy issue that comes to your mind? Because these days, many people talk of public policy, which is not necessarily economic policy. Anything on your mind?
There are so many, Subodh. There are so many, but as you know, just now you pointed out this concurrent list problem. It's a huge obstacle, and something needs to be done about it. And that is, it is public policy at a very high level of policy. Going down sort of the kind of hierarchy of public policy issues, it's competence, the competence of government, state government, municipal government, central government, or even educational institutions. You have the IITs, IIMs, universities, and so on. There is a huge competence issue there because of all the well-known reasons in the manner of recruitment. Okay, let me just put it this way, that the obsession with equity has allowed fairness to be relegated to the background, and the two are not the same. And that's something which we have not understood in this country, that equity is not fairness. And if you're not fair in the manner in which you do things, it will show up in your performance indicators. So you may appear to be very equitable, but are you being fair? So stuff like that. Baki to, there is so many things. Water is Bangalore doesn't have water.
Right.
Why? It's ridiculous.
It's ridiculous. It's totally ridiculous.
And why? Well, it's because public policy has been framed keeping in mind the real estate developers.
Well, I mean, they are not the leaders in it. Chennai showed the way.
It's just
how to be water free. You just have to wonder which next city is going to be water free.
It's extraordinary that 15 years ago, 20 years ago, बिजली नहीं होती थी. अब बिजली है, पानी नहीं है.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to have you here. And let's end this here for the time being. And,
okay. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you so much. We'll have you back after the elections, after things have calmed down. It'll take maybe 3 months for new policies and all to come. We'll talk about it at that time. Okay, let's end it here. All right.
Okay. Bye-bye.